You know, with everybody talking about the end of Stranger Things, Season 5 finally coming down the pipe, the whole world looking at Hawkins again, it's funny how we quickly forget where the road actually started. We get caught up in the upside down, the demogorgons, the kids on bikes, and we forget that before it was a show, it was a whisper. Before it was a script, it was a place. And honestly, the place is a hell of a lot scarier than the soundstage. We're talking about the eastern tip of Long Island, Montauk. The End. That's what the locals call it, right? The End. It is a fitting name, especially when you start digging into what allegedly happened under the concrete of Camp Hero. Most people look at Montauk and see a summer retreat, lobster rolls, expensive sweaters, the lighthouse. But if you drive past the tourist spots out towards the point, you see it. You can't miss it. The Sage Radar Tower. It's this massive rustling hunk of steel sitting there like a tombstone for the Cold War. It doesn't spin anymore, but it watches. And for decades, there have been people, locals, drifters, former military, who swear that the radar dish wasn't just watching the sky for Soviet bombers. They said it was looking inside people's heads. They said it was staring holes in time. Now, I'm not saying I buy every word of it. I'm just saying that when you stand in the shadow of the dish, the silence feels heavy. It feels like the ground is holding a secret it's dying to spill. So while everyone else is waiting to see how the show ends, I think we should go back to the beginning, back to the specific coordinates, the specific claims, and the very real military installation that inspired the whole nightmare. It's a story about paranoia, about the military-industrial complex running off the rails, and about the terrifying idea that our reality might be a lot more fragile than we think. Put another log on the fire, man, and let's talk about it. If you enjoy this type of content about paranormal, aliens, UFOs, true crime, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe so you can join our community and spread the love. To understand the Montauk Project, you have to understand the geography. You have to understand the isolation. In the 1970s and the early 80s, Montauk wasn't the playground for the Hamptons elite that is today. In the winter, it was desolate. Winds whipping off the Atlantic, grey skies, empty roads. It was the kind of place where you could do something quiet and dirty and nobody would ask questions because nobody was there to ask them. Camp Hero sits right on that edge. It was commissioned during World War II, originally disguised as a fishing village to fool German U-boats. From the start, the place was built on deception. They had fake houses, fake churches, all made of plywood, sitting on top of heavy concrete bunkers. By the time the Cold War heated up, the deception changed. It wasn't about hiding from U-boats anymore. It was about the Sage radar system. This massive AN FPS-35 radar dish, and we're talking tons of steel looking like a giant screen, was installed to detect incoming Soviet threats. That part is history. That part is verified. It generated massive amounts of electromagnetic energy. Locals back then will tell you about the radios acting up, weird interference on their TVs, or headaches that would come and go with the pulsing of the dish. But the story we're interested in starts when the Air Force officially shut the base down around 1981. See, the gates closed, the personnel supposedly left, the lights were supposed to go out. But according to the people who lived nearby, the lights didn't go out, not entirely. The claim is that while the surface was abandoned, the underground levels, the bunkers beneath that fake fishing village, woke up. And this is where we meet Preston Nichols. You can't tell this story without him. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a spy, he was just an electronics engineer, a guy who had claimed to have a background in parapsychology and radio waves. He's the primary architect of this entire legend. Nichols didn't look like a hero, he looked like a guy you'd see at the ham radio convention. Glasses, unassuming, soft-spoken, but he began recovering memories. That's how he described it. Not all at once, but in fragments. He claimed that he had been living a double life. And by day a regular engineer, by night or during these missing time periods he was working at Camp Hero, deep underground, managing experiments that technically shouldn't exist. He talked about walking through the abandoned sections of the base and feeling a sense of deja vu so strong it made him nauseous. He started poking around, bringing his own frequency counters and equipment to the perimeter of the park. What he found, or what he claimed to find, was that the radar wasn't dormant, but it was active. It wasn't broadcasting in a way that tracked planes. It was broadcasting in a way that interacted with consciousness. He described frequencies that matched the human's brain sleep cycle, mood regulation, and cognitive functions. Nichols painted a picture of a facility that had gone rogue, no longer under the thumb of the US Air Force but funded by darker money. Some say Nazi gold recovered after World War II, while others say black budget siphons. The goal wasn't defense anymore, the goal was control. The atmosphere Nichols describes in his accounts is suffocating. He talks about the delta level and the underground tunnels being cold, smelling of ozone and stale air. He describes a mix of military discipline and absolute scientific recklessness. It was men in lab coats who had stopped asking if they should do something and only care if they could. This friction between the sleepy, windswept surface of the state park where people walk their dogs and the alleged high-tech horror show happening 50 feet beneath their boots is what makes the Montauk meat so sticky. It suggests that the monster isn't in a faraway land, it's right under the picnic table. So let's look at what they were actually doing down there, or rather what the legends say they were doing. Because if you believe the accounts from Nichols and a man named Ol Billick, the Montauk Project was essentially an industrial-scale effort to crack the human mind and the fabric of space-time. It wasn't just one experiment, it was a buffet of nightmares. The cornerstone of the whole operation was something called the Montauk Chair. Now, this sounds like a prop from a B-movie, but Nichols describes it with the kind of boring technical specificity that will make you pause and think about it. He describes a modified chair, heavily shielded, lined with sensors and coils. The idea was based on the technology supposedly recovered from the Philadelphia experiment. If you remember that famous naval legend from 1943 where the USS Eldridge allegedly turned invisible and teleported. The claim is that the technology that scrambled the sailors' brains in 43 had been refined. They weren't trying to move ships anymore, they were trying to interface a human psychic with a computer. The operator, often a man named Duncan Cameron, who we'll get to in a minute, would sit in the chair. The sensors will pick up his electromagnetic visualizations. If he visualized a solid object, the computer would interpret that signal, amplify it to the massive transmitters on the surface, that sage radar dish, and theoretically manifest that thought into reality, or at the very least, project the thought into the minds of other people. This is where the mood control stories come from. Nichols claimed they would test this on the local population. They set the dish to emit a crime wave frequency, and suddenly, petty theft and fights would spike in the town of Montauk. They'd set it to hopelessness, and a gloom would settle over the populace. It is a terrifying concept, like mass manipulation via radio waves, but manipulating moods was just the warm-up. The darker, much heavier claim involves the Montauk Boys. This is the part that really mirrors the fictional lab in Hawkins. The narrative goes that the scientists realized adults' minds were too rigid, they had too much life experience, too much resistance to programming, so they needed blank slates. They needed malleability. According to the lore, they began recruiting, which is a polite word for abducting, runaways, orphans, and vulnerable kids from the streets. Nichols and other claimants described lines of bunk beds in the subterranean levels. These boys were allegedly subjected to intense psychological and physical trauma to break their wills, to fragment their personalities so that new programming could be inserted. They wanted super soldiers or sleeper agents or time travel pilots. The accounts differ on the end goal, but the method was always brutally masked as science. They verify nothing, of course. There are no official records of missing children traced to Camp Hero, no bodies found. But the oral history persists, driven by a man who claimed years later to have recovered memories of being those boys. They talk about the fear tests, the sensory deprivation, and the chair. And then you have the time travel aspect. This is where the science gets loose. The claim is that by using the psychic amplification of the chair, they discovered they could open vortices. Not just mental projections, but physical tunnels. Literally physical tunnels. A literal hole in the air. Nichols described it as a spiraling tunnel of light. They would send cameras at first, then animals, and finally people. They were sending operatives into the past and into the future. Al Billick, who is a central figure in this circle, claimed he was actually a man named Ed Cameron, which is Duncan's brother, who had been involved in the Philadelphia experiment, jumped off the USS Eldridge in 1943, landed in the future, and was regressed and sent back to work at Montauk. It's convoluted, it's a headache to track the timeline. But the core of the claim is that they were mapping time. They were going back to change outcomes of wars. They were going forward to see the apocalypse. They were treating the fourth dimension like a subway system. And the fuel for this engine wasn't gasoline or uranium. It was the consciousness of the psychic in the chair. The documentation for this, it's non-existent in the official sense. You won't find a Freedom of Information Act release that says Montauk Project time travel budget. But what you do find are strange coincidences. You find vast amounts of electrical power being routed to a closed base. You find the fact that the Sage radar remained powered and potentially operational long after it was obsolete. You have the testimonies of local construction workers who talk about pouring obscene amounts of concrete for underground levels that basically don't exist. You have the weird magnetic anomalies at the part that make compasses spin. It is a tapestry of maybes, and that's where the danger lies, because even if 10% of what Nichols claimed about the psychological conditioning is true, even if you strip away the time travel and the monsters, you're left with a rogue group of scientists experimenting on human beings in the dark. And that is scary enough on its own. The facility operated in a bubble of absolute secrecy, protected by the isolation of the point and the cover story of a derelict Air Force station. But see, bubbles eventually have to burst. Pressure builds, and in the narrative of the Montauk Project, the pressure came from the very person powering the machine. We have to talk about Duncan Cameron. In the script of this conspiracy, he is the tragic figure. He is the battery. Nichols described Duncan as having a unique psychic sensitivity, something that made him the primary candidate for the chair. But it wasn't a gift, it was more of a burden, because the scientist, led by a figure often referred to as Dr. von Neumann, allegedly the same famous physicist, somehow still alive or displaced in time, pushed Duncan to his limits. They weren't just asking him to visualize an apple or a chair. They were asking him to visualize specific points in history. They were asking him to open doors. The strain on Duncan was immense. You have to imagine the physical toll. Hooked up to electrodes, pumped full of drugs to enhance conductivity, his mind being flayed open by the massive electromagnetic output of the transmitter. He was the seeing eye. But the thing about looking into the void is that the void looks back. The experiment started getting sloppy. The boundaries between Duncan's subconscious fears and the reality of the base began to blur. Nichols claims that during the later stages, roughly around 1982 and 1983, the manifestations became harder to control. Duncan would have a stray thought, a moment of panic, and things would materialize in the base. Poltergeist activity, objects, moving apparitions, the scientists, in their hubris, didn't stop. They were drunk in the power of it. They had conquered time, or so they thought. They assumed they could control the variable of the human mind just like they control the voltage on a radar dish. But the human mind isn't a circuit board. It has corners, it has dark basements on its own. And Duncan, after years of alleged abuse and programming, had a lot of darkness stored up. The friction between Preston Nichols, who was becoming increasingly disillusioned and horrified by what he saw, and the project directors was peaking. They knew something had to give. There was a sense that they were approaching a threshold they couldn't cross back from. They were playing God with a shaky hand, and the stakes were no longer just about research. It was about containment. If Duncan lost control in the chair, hooked up to a transmitter capable of influencing the minds of millions or other people, or ripping holes into the atmosphere, the fallout wouldn't be just local, it would be catastrophic. And yet the order came down: keep the chair running, crank up the power, see how far we can go. But see, this was the classic mistake, right? Because they pushed the engine past the red line, ignoring the smoke pouring out of the hood. August 12, 1983, that's the date. In the Montauk lore, this is the day the world almost ended, or at least the day the project ate itself. It's a day that mirrors the Philadelphia experiment exactly 40 years prior, a harmonic convergence of biorhythms and magnetic fields according to the theory. The base was buzzing, the transmitter was humming at full power. Duncan Cameron was in the chair, deep in a trance state. But this time something was different. Nichols claims that he and a few others had secretly planned to sabotage the project. They had whispered in Duncan's ears day before, planting a seed of rebellion in his subconscious. They told him to unleash it, to let the monster out. They realized the only way to stop the machine was to make the machine destroy itself. So Duncan is in the chair. The hum of the equipment rises to a scream, and suddenly Duncan isn't visualizing a location or a time, he's visualizing a beast. Nichols describes it vividly: a hairy, massive creature, hungry and angry. And because the transmitter is amplifying his thought forms into reality, this thing doesn't just stay in his head, it materializes, it appears in the base. The accounts describe a chaotic scene of panic. This beast from the ID starts tearing through the facility, is smashing equipment, is terrifying the personnel. But this wasn't a biological animal that you could just shoot. It was a solid projection of pure rage sustained by the energy of the transmitter. It was the physical embodiment of the project's madness. At the same time, the time tunnels were fluctuating widely. The connection between 1943 and 1983 was locking in. The energy levels were critical. Nichols knew he had to kill the power. He describes running through the chaotic corridors, dodging the panic, trying to get to the power distribution center. The scientists couldn't shut it down via the control because the system was locked in a feedback loop. So Nichols and his co-conspirators grabbed axes, fire axes, heavy wrenches, whatever they could find, and started physically destroying the equipment. They smashed the conduit, they severed the heavy cables feeding the transmitter because they had to cut the juice of the chair to stop the signal feeding the beast. It sounds insane, right? A physical monster rampaging through a secret base while a scientist hacks at power cables with an axe. It's the climax of a blockbuster. But Nichols tells it with this flat, trauma-informed effect like it's nothing. He describes the spark flying, the smell of burning insulation, the screaming of equipment as it died. When they finally severed the power, the transmitter died. The hum stopped, and slowly the beast began to fade. It didn't die like an animal, it dissolved. It turned back into mist, back into nothingness, because the consciousness that was projecting it had been disconnected. The time tunnel collapsed, the link to 1943 was severed, and the base went dark. Silence rushed back in, replacing the roar of the generator. They were left standing in the wreckage of millions of dollars of equipment, the smell of ozone hanging in the air, realizing they had just burned the whole thing down to save it. The aftermath was swift. According to the story, the military, or the shadow group running the show, moved in immediately. They didn't arrest Nichols or the others, they allegedly brainwashed them. wipe their memories and reset them to their civilian defaults and send them back to their lives. The base was scrubbed, the lower levels where the chair sat and where the beast had roamed were sealed off. They said they poured endless amounts of cement into the elevator shafts, burying the technology and the trauma under tons of grey slurry. They locked the gates and they walked away. Camp Hero eventually became a state park. Families now go there. They have picnics near the cliffs. They hike the trail. But the memory of the place is stubborn. Nichols eventually claimed his memories came back, fragment by fragment, leading to books, the lectures, and the cult following. People still go to the park with Geiger counters and magnetometers. They found spots where the readings spike for no reason. They find steel concrete doors that shouldn't be there. They hear the hum. So, it's easy to dismiss it as all fantasy, a story concocted by a man who watched too many sci-fi shows. But when you stand there looking at that rusted radar dish against the grey sky, you have to wonder, why was the power running for so long? Why is the concrete so thick? Why does the air feel so charged? Maybe it is fiction, maybe it's just a story we tell ourselves in the dark to make the Cold War seem more interesting. Or maybe beneath the dirt and the roots of the scrub oak, there is a chair sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to sit down and turn the lights back on. Truth? Fiction? You decide. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to click this one right here or right here. I'm sure you're gonna like it as much. Until next time, keep the good vibes and spread the love. RPDC, signing out.